Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition, I'll be joined by my co-host, Dr. William Sorrell, Professor Emeritus of African and African American Studies at Lehman College, as we discuss a new, exciting book on the history of Detroit entitled Black Detroit, A People's History of Self-Determination, written by award-winning journalist, author of over 25 books, as well as a scholar on African-American history, Herb Boyd. Welcome to Cultural Caravan. Well, we're also joined by Dr. William Sorrell. Again, we want to thank you so much for staying for this part. And we really wanted to actually kind of start with what inspired you to write this work as relates to the history of our people in Detroit?
Ms. Dente, this is my 25th book, and most of the books, I would say more than half of them, came to me. I didn't go looking for them. And it certainly was the case here with Black Detroit. I have like a most just remarkable agent, and she has brought me some of these projects over the years. You remember Brother Man was one that she brought me, the whole Odyssey of Black Men in America, and we got the American Book Award for that in 1995. And so over the years, she continued to throw these projects at me. And I guess she figured that, hey, about time you focus and take it back home again, you know, and because I've been living in Harlem now since 1985, my third time living in New York, going back to 1959, 1960, and in 1978 for about 7 or 8 months. But coming back in 1985, you know, I've been here. So when she approached me with the project to do a book on Detroit, I said, well, look, I've been in Harlem, you know, for a whole generation. She said, but you're carrying all of that history around with you. It's just a matter of going and dredging it up. And she was absolutely right. You know, I started reflecting on it, and then after going back and forth, because I go back and forth to Detroit all the time. My mother is there. She's 97 years old, and she is like just an absolute inexhaustible reservoir of information. And my sounding board, my challenges, you know, and going back and forth with her. She arrived in Detroit in 1941, and then doing a reconnaissance, kind of a field trip, looking at the lay of the land, and came back 2 years later and brought me and my brother. And so that was the beginning of my connection to Detroit. I arrived there 2 months before the race riot of 1943. So my agent figured that that's what we're going to go back and bring all those memories to fore. And then you can verify them and confirm them through your research. You know, go to the repositories, because I know where all the bodies are buried. You know, I know where the absolute places to go to get the kind of information to kind of confirm some of the, because you can't always trust your memory. And you go back and get that information, the files, the dusty volumes, the letters, and what have you, to make sure that you're accurate about that, because, you know, once you put it down on the page, you know, you got to live with it. You know, so I started with my agent. She came with the project, hooked me up with a very fine editor, Tracy Sherrard, who's from Flint, Michigan, by the way. So they kind of like, oh, that's a deal is sealed. Let's do this thing. So in about a year, I wrote the book in about 1 year, but, you know, hey, I've lived that Detroit experience, you know, more than 70 years. So I think I was ready for the project. I hope it was ready for me.
I read your book. It was very fascinating, because it's not necessarily a political history, nor is it a cultural history. You bring in people that are somewhat obscure to the average reader, but also you bring in people who are fairly well known, like mayors like Coleman Young.
Sure.
And I'd like to know, how did you approach this book? I mean, you're writing about a city, and you're writing from the beginning of the origins of Detroit right down until present time. So how do you decide what's important and what's not so important?
That's always a challenge, you know, Bill. I think one of the things, the book is episodically done. Each decade, almost just about each decade, there's a pivotal moment. There's an event, an individual, some circumstances that make it stand out. I started in 1701, you know, with the whole founding of the city with Cadillac, the French explorer that comes in. And of course, the Native American population configures quite prominently in these early years, and I got to do a fairly decent job there, but you can't stay too long with that because you got 300 years to deal with.
I'm sure people are surprised about the slavery issue.
Oh yeah, that's another thing about that is a lot of, even Detroiters, they're not aware that once upon a time there was slavery right there in the city. Very, like here in New York too, same kind of thing. People are not aware of how significant the whole slave period was in terms of the foundation, the foundings of that particular city. Detroit had that experience, and I quickly move on to that right into, if you talk about slavery, almost inseparable from that is the abolitionist movement, the whole movement to do away with slavery. And Detroit had some absolutely phenomenal abolitionists there, and I focus on them right on down to the Blackburn Affair. So for the 1830s, there's the Blackburn Affair. These two fugitive slaves that run away from Louisville, Kentucky, and end up in Detroit, and at last become the center, you know, the kind of focal point of the abolitionist movement, the struggle, because they're apprehended by the sheriff who arrests them, you know, because they are runaway fugitives. And so at last, the abolitionists say, no way, and we're going to get them out of the jailhouse, and we're going to get them off to Canada, because Detroit, you know, have that very unique geographical location right across the river from Canada. So when you reach that particular terminal as a part of the Underground Railroad, then the next stop would be across the river to Canada. So I start right there, Bill, and each succeeding decade, I find a moment, an event. In the 1920s, when Henry Ford makes his $5 a day offer, and the whole influx of these migrants, these blues people that come in from Mississippi and Alabama, almost like a straight line migration for people who came from Alabama, including Coleman Young from Tuscaloosa. And then right on down to the 1920s when Dr. Ocean Sweet, this black doctor, moves into an all-white neighborhood and creates quite a melee there, and a man is killed because they shoot on him and they fires back. So that Clarence Darrow comes in to represent the family that's charged, you know, with the murder of the man, the mob outside of his house, right down to the arsenal of democracy in the World War II. You know, my mother was very much a part of that. She was kind of a black Rosie the Riveter. So the 1930s, 1940s, the race riot of 1943, then you move down to the 1950 period, the coming in of the whole civil rights movement, 1963 when they had the whole Walk to Freedom, which is kind of a dry run, you know, rehearsal for the March on Washington in 1963. So, you know, you got the Motown development in 1959, the music that Berry Gordy put there. So we began to talk about some of the individuals, you know, who were like key figures as entrepreneurs, as activists, or whether they were religious leaders, you know, all of those individuals come into play, so from each generation.
You don't necessarily know everything you're going to write when you first start out. So what surprised you about your research about Detroit?
Well, I had so many different kind of discoveries and surprises as I went along. You know, I thought I had Detroit's history cold. You can't tell me nothing about Detroit I didn't know. But I made all of these very fascinating discoveries, you know, in terms of the first things that Detroit developed. You know, I knew about the whole music thing, but what about Elijah McCoy? A lot of people know nothing about, this is a real McCoy, but he spent time in Detroit as one of the major inventors. Even Elijah Muhammad, of course, I knew that history pretty well in terms of the creation, the rise of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X, that connection there. I had pretty much his history together because he influenced me. I had an opportunity to be with him when I was, you know, my early 20s and working with the Nation of Islam back then. So some of that stuff, kind of digging into those things and coming up with a little bit more information than on the surface. Those were some of the remarkable gems of discovery that I made. People whose history I thought I knew pretty well, but once you start doing the research, you know, all these different little information pop up. Cynthia Scott was a young girl who was alleged to be a prostitute who was shot down and killed by the cops in the summer of 1963. And she lived upstairs over me on the north end of Detroit. So I knew when she was a little girl. So when I heard about that she had been shot down, I was in the Army at that time, but my mother was on top of stuff and sending me all kind of information about her. So when I started doing the research on it, I said, who is she? You know, I knew her as a kid, as a little girl and everything, but I started doing a little bit more research about her. And then after she was killed, the organizations that arose in protests about the police brutality, that's one of the major themes in the book, the whole question of police brutality across the ages in Detroit.
When you think about Detroit, and also you can bring into Chicago and New York City, what are the forces that cause the elections of African Americans as mayors, but what are the forces that led to white mayors coming back on the scene?
I think one of the things that you have is that the whole electoral process, you know, and the kind of diminishing returns maybe you get from one administration. So you look for some hope in the next one coming along. It has much to do with the legacy of Coleman Young is very important in the city of Detroit. He spent 20 years in office, you know, from 1974 to 1994. And then you had a succession of mayors thereafter, some good, some bad. You know, in other words, the kind of corruption and the kind of lack of vision that they didn't have that Coleman brought because of the whole background he had. What happens with the union movement in terms of getting out the vote? What happened with the religious leaders who were very formidable in terms of coalitions and bring them together to bring about elected officials there? A lot of that kind of was a decline there. It kind of faded off and they went off in another direction. So it's hard to put your finger on one particular thing that would bring about change. There's a number of factors that come into play. When you look at Detroit, okay, you have like the deindustrialization, the collapse, you know, the automobile industry, and ultimately the bankruptcy that occurred there. To say nothing of the white flight, but it was black flight also. The 1967 rebellion, that's another critical issue that hurt the city, and we're still trying to recover, you know, from the 1967 rebellion.
There's a movie out now called Detroit.
Uh-oh.
And has that had an impact on your book, either way?
One of the things the question was asked me is Herb, your book, was that film based on your book? I said the only thing they have in common is that they hit the market at the same time, and then it's kind of a radical departure at that point. Obviously, I talk about the 67 rebellion. I talk about the Algiers motel incident, but Catherine Bigelow, the filmmaker, she focuses just on that particular moment, but the camera never pulls back to give a understanding, the full, and contextualize that. And you can see a little bit more drama going on. Some of the individuals are given a little bit more than just cameo appearances. You begin to know who these victims were. You have no idea about their lives at all. There's no sense of black agency there. And she missed a remarkable opportunity to do that with the People's Tribunal. And that occurred, you know, because we recognized that the 3 cops that killed the 3 young black men in the Algiers motel annex, we knew they were going to walk. They were not going to be convicted. They'd be acquitted, exonerated, what have you. And certainly that happened. She chose a speech of that in the film. She could have focused on the People's Tribunal. That was a sense of black agency, because out of that mobilized community grew a number of very important political formations. Some of you've heard of the Republic of New Africa, the Shrine of the Black Madonna, the Illegal Revolutionary Black Workers, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, even a revitalized Nation of Islam. All of those came as a result of the People's Tribunal. That was not even mentioned in the film.
The success of your book, because you have some very outstanding reviews, which is always helpful for any writer, is that going to encourage you to try to do an update history of Harlem? Because we had David Levering Lewis books, and we had other books on Harlem's history, but it's more like pre-World War II. Mm-hmm. Do you envision doing something on Harlem similar to what you did on Detroit? You know,
I've been something that I wanted to do with Professor Bill Sorrell for many years. And I think we have something in the works along those lines. I've been doing a lot of work and kind of research that you've already done. I mean, you've driven the shovel right into the soil, and giving me a lot of information in terms of the orphanage, the work that you did, going back to the whole draft riots of 1863, which of course is another connection in terms of what I try to do in the book is show similarities between the commonalities from Detroit to Harlem, and particularly New York City. And of course the draft riots is one. The 1943 riot, we had one in Harlem for the same reasons too, in terms of false rumors, or the 63 thing based upon the competition of jobs between the various ethnic groups, the black and the Irish more than any. And the incidents that grew out of that, kind of very horrendous aspects, and that set those cities back. It took them a long time to recover from the 1863 riot. So, yes, we should begin to talk about a history of Harlem.
Yeah, I'm interested in something that has been alluded to historically, and that is we, as resident citizens of the United States, we're a nation within a nation. And I wonder, how can our cities, our African-American dominated cities, at least in population, take that concept, a nation within a nation, and move forward that we have real progress and we have real power, because we kind of go in increments. We get a little bit of power in mayors for maybe 6, 7, 8 years, and then we find ourselves back again with police brutality and back with economic denials. Can we be a nation within a nation, you think?
I think in effect we are. It's just a matter of how you begin to take that kind of neo-colonial situation and dispose of it, or how you begin to utilize it. Because one of the things I talk about in Detroit is almost being like a third world city, the third world country. I use Dhaka out of Bangladesh, as an example of that. And you begin to say, well, what do you mean by that? I said, well, infant mortality, let's look at that. You look at the whole homeless situation, the whole food desert that exists there, not a major supermarket in the city. So it's a number of those kind of elements that we need to fight. That's when we say self-determination in the subtitle of the book. That's what we're trying to overcome from one generation to another, from one decade to another.
I believe it might have been Alexander Crummell in the 19th century, an Episcopalian minister who spent 20 years in Liberia, and who was instrumental in starting the American Negro Academy in 1897. And I believe it was Crummell, if not, it was one of his associates, who said, we as a people, we have a condition in common, but not a culture in common, which I interpret to mean that our condition was slavery, or our condition is poverty, but once some of us escape those conditions, then we don't have unity, because we said, well, we're out of that system now.
Yes.
And I think that's the reason why we have these ups and downs politically and economically. Yeah, what do you think?
Roller coaster effect. One of the things about it, one of the things I'm trying to do and say in Black Detroit is that it becomes like a model that could be emulated by other communities. They do the same thing. And so the full tapestry of the African American experience, it can move from community. It's a study in the history of these African American communities. Gary, Indiana, I was talking to an individual, they were talking about the whole migration period. I said, well, a lot of those migrants, didn't go to Chicago, didn't go to Detroit, they went to Gary, Indiana, become very important, significant workers in the whole steel industry out there. And there's been a book on that, Black workers in the steel industry. But of course, it was done many, many years ago, in the same way that we had a book on Chicago, the Black metropolis, that Horace Caton and St. Clair Drake did, what Du Bois did with the Philadelphia Negro. So Black Detroit is a continuation of that. That's what can we update those particular kind of concerns where we begin to document our history, document our experience, and maybe other communities, Black Atlanta, Black Washington, D.C., Black Philadelphia, some of these other important, Black Houston, Black L.A., they put those books out, and then taken together, we have the full tapestry, the full tableau of the African American experience.
When you think about Detroit, it has been the site of some magnificent beginnings in Black history. You're talking about one of the most prominent Black developed Motown came out of there. You talk about some tremendous artists. You're talking about some early revolutionary organizations, whether it be the Nation of Islam, Noble Drew Ali. You're talking about the birthplace of a lot of different things.
Yes.
And to see, and the fact that today, when you say Detroit, the mindset goes to, people, so particularly those who are in the city, who may or may not be, go to Detroit and they think about Detroit. When we say, well, why is he talking about Detroit? What's the big deal about Detroit? Thinking about the lesson that we can learn from the Detroits around the country, what is it that you want people to take away from this book?
Well, I think, Ms. Dente, you make a very interesting point in terms of the city is being the seminal or the origins of so many important institutions and organizations, political formations. I look at it from the standpoint of like literary. I just recently attended the 50th anniversary of Third World Press in Chicago, but it grew out of the Broadside Press in Detroit, which was Dudley Randall, the outstanding poet. Remember, he had that great poem that he wrote. It seems to me, says Booker T, I don't agree, said W.E.B. So, but more than a poet, he was an entrepreneur, and he pulled together this here fascinating, very significant platform for writers in this country. The Gwendolyn Brooks, the Sonia Sanchez, the Etheridge Knight, and of course the Donnell Lee, who became Haki Madhubuti. All of them got their start at Broadside Press. Look at the whole radio. We talk about Dr. Wendell Cox and Dr. Haley Bell put together the first radio stations that was black owned in this country. Earlier we talked about the Elijah McCoy, the kind of contributions, the innovations that he brought to the whole mechanical industry in terms of the oiling that had to be done and the coupling, of the whole automotive, to say nothing of the trains in this country. If you go back and look at the religious institutions, the Reverend C.L. Franklin, what he did there in terms of inspiring a number of ministers, when the eagle stirreth in his nest, are probably one of the most famous sermons of them all. And of course, the daughter that he gave to us, Aretha Franklin. So the whole music, the literary, the sports, you can go into that, to say nothing of the politics, the whole, the industry, the burial industry. I mean, the Charles Diggs family, the families, the Pelham family there, to create the first black newspaper of really significance in this country, right in Detroit. So Detroit is like this kind of seminal point for a number of these developments. You're absolutely right. And people ask you, why Detroit? Well, you say, in the beginning was Detroit.
Well, we have briefly talked about Detroit in our really short time here. And I would like to, for my part, have a concluding question. And that is, how do you see yourself, and what is your legacy?
My legacy?
Yeah, your legacy.
Well, sometimes, it's hard to think about that without looking at the contributions that you make. I see myself as a AAA person. Now, I don't go out and haul cars in off the highway, but I'm an author, I'm an academic, I'm an activist. And at some point, all those things come together for me because as a journalist, I'm running around there, and I've been doing that for, my goodness, some 60 years now as a journalist. So the information that I compile, as a journalist, is some kind of, is fossilized, crystallized, sabotaged in some way, and put right back into the book. And then the book is like, I terrorize my students with it in the classroom. So it's kind of like this circular aspect of information. It's kind of like taking it and refining it and recycling, what you pick up. Journalism for me is the first draft of history, and that's what you have in Black Detroit. A lot of that is my journalism that I did working for black newspapers like the Michigan Chronicle, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the Amsterdam News, where I've been some 35 years. And so when we start talking about the history of Harlem, believe me, Bill, we'll go back into the archives, back into the repositories, back into the morgue of these newspapers where it all starts,
I just want to say, on behalf of Culture Cultural Caravan. We really want to salute your work, your contribution to our collective history in terms of capturing a very important aspect of our history, because Detroit is a microcosm of African American history. It actually captures the greatness, the genius, the struggles, and soulfully the fact that Detroit is rising. Despite all the challenges, it is coming back. And certainly the resiliency of Detroit and the resiliency of our community. So again, I just want to say we really salute you, what you're doing. We salute your work. And for those who are interested in getting a copy of this wonderful work entitled Black Detroit, A People's History of Self-Determination, tell us how they can get a copy.
Well, the one here in New York, the Schaumburg is a good place to start. Of course, the Barnes and Nobles, the Amazons, I mean, it's almost at all Sisters right here in Harlem. You can go up to Sisters Uptown. They have different kind of organizations, the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, all of them will be picking up. We're trying to put together something with the National Writers Union now. And we're going to have a major launch here in New York, and maybe I can come back and talk to you about that, and see exactly how the National Writers Union, the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, the Amsterdam News, the Local 1199 have all put their heads together and have this here major launch, In other words, where are all those Detroiters who live in New York? We can bring them all. And it's a bunch of them too, particularly on the entertainment front,
It's a very special day for me to have both of you here to talk about our history. And certainly, hopefully we'll be able to get a wonderful new work about Harlem, right? That we started our own little chronicle, but it'd be great to have you both collaborate. That'd be tremendous. I can't wait for that book. Okay. Well, until then, I hope you've enjoyed our broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. And please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.